Force is strong in my family. The Force is strong in my family. My father has it. My father has it. I have it. I have it. My sister has it. My sister has it. You have that power too. You have that power too. In time, you'll learn to use it as I have.
We would be honored if you would join us.
Chewie, we're home.
My Nerd World.
And welcome to it. It's episode number 48 of the My Nerd World Star Wars podcast. I am your host, John Justice, and apologies up front if you were looking for a podcast last week. I did not get one done, and I really don't have a good excuse. You know, they talk about when it comes to podcasting, one of the keys is being consistent in your podcasts, and I'm pretty sure, apart from holidays, this is only the second time that I've missed a week. It was a slow news week last week, and I did have something that I had planned on talking about, which I will put into today's podcast, this podcast, number 48 of the My Nerd World podcast. But, you know, life got in the way. That's my biggest excuse. There's been a lot going on in my world in terms of my regular radio show, and the time just didn't afford me. So I apologize if you were looking for the podcast last week and it did not come out. But I am very pleased to say that if it's any consolation, I'm glad that I actually waited a week because I waited a week, we actually ended up with a heck of a lot more to talk about than what essentially I had anticipated to be covering last week on the podcast. So we're going to start out with a bit of, well, not a bit, quite a bit of Rogue One news. We've got Rogue One news I want to talk about. We've got some photographs, some production photos of Episode 8 I want to get into, some training of Daisy Ridley, some leaks in terms of costume styles for Episode 8. Most of the conversation will be centered around Episode 8 for today's podcast. And then we are going to talk about Episode 8 and what I think is arguably the biggest gamble that Star Wars has taken thus far. In all of the Star Wars creations, in all of the different iterations, I think that we are on the cusp of the most daring Star Wars gamble ever. I'm not talking about Rogue One. I'll tell you what I'm talking about coming up a little bit later on the in the podcast. But we have lots to get to, so let's not waste any time.
On your own from the age of 15. Reckless, aggressive, and undisciplined.
This is a rebellion, isn't it? I rebel.
We have a mission for you. A major weapons test is imminent. We need to know what it is and how to destroy it.
Is that clear?
Yes, sir.
So we have what could be considered spoilers, but from what I am hearing about what we're going to find out before Rogue One is released, what I'm hearing is, and this comes from MakingStarWars.net, is that more than likely we're going to find out about most of these characters, at least in terms of who they are, before the movie comes out. You don't need the level of secrecy apart from plotline, really, and in plot details that you have on an Episode 8 or an Episode 7. It's just not necessary when it comes to a movie like this being a one-off film, a standalone film. The first thing that I want to address is a quick theory. I'll try not to spend a lot of time on it, but I keep hearing people with the biggest speculation being, in terms of what we've seen so far. In the trailer, there's that brief glimpse of an Imperial room with two of the red Imperial guards that only guarded Emperor Palpatine in Return of the Jedi, standing in around what looks to be a Bacta tank, a healing tank, and a cloaked character walking in the room that most people don't seem to think is Darth Vader, just based off of the silhouette stature and the fact that he's wearing a hood. I've theorized in previous podcasts that I think it could be Darth Vader if he's just wearing a hood over his head. I think that would be interesting. They could go really bold and show a Vader with the helmet off, with just the breathing apparatus, which I also think would be an incredibly bold move if they were to go and do that. Be that as it may, I don't know who that character is. That character could be anybody. You see the one black stormtrooper in the trailer, and he's also on what we've seen of the toy packaging. He seems to be one of the focused at the center bad guys of the film. It's a black stormtrooper helmet, but it's got more of an elongated snout, if you will. It doesn't have sort of the mouth-esque design on the front of it. It's kind of long. To be honest with you, that helmet is a little jarring. I'm not completely sold on that particular design. We're so used to seeing the classic Stormtrooper helmet and also the Stormtroopers in The Force Awakens that, those helmets themselves have a very distinct look to them, and they're very reminiscent of eyes and a mouth. I'm actually looking at them right now. I mean, just they look like mouths on them, and the Stormtrooper ones, they're reminiscent of a weird-looking mouth the way the vents are in the front. This one doesn't have that definitive look to it, so it's a little more, say, Boba Fett-esque than what we see in a normal Stormtrooper, and I find it a little distracting, to be honest with you. But more to my point, that character in that shot that kneels down before that Bacta tank, I mean, it could be that guy with a hood on, right? Or female, I guess. Here's my theory, though, on who's in that Bacta tank. I think it's the Emperor. And I actually think it's pretty obvious it's the Emperor. They're not showing us Darth Vader, but they're showing us a room with what appears to be a Bacta tank. And this could be one of those moments, too, where maybe in the movie, you actually immediately see who's in the Bacta tank, like you did Luke in The Empire Strikes Back, but maybe for the trailer, they CGI'd it out to make it look more smoky, right? But I think the fact that the Royal Guards, the Imperial Guards, are in the room, I think is a pretty clear sign that that's the Emperor in there. And I really like the idea of what if perhaps that's one of the closing shots of the film, and what if the Emperor is hurt in the film at some point in time. When you think about the fact that, most movies have a villain, and that villain needs to be defeated at some point. You can't do that to Darth Vader. You can't do it to the Emperor. You could do it to that character, that black stormtrooper I was talking about. You could do it to the character who, is reminiscent of Thrawn in the white cape. I'm assuming he's not going to make it out of it, right? But, what if the Emperor gets injured at some point in the film and he has to get placed in that Bacta tank? What if, the Emperor, who obviously is still in control of the Imperial Senate at the time of Rogue One, because you don't hear until A New Hope that moment when Tarkin says, the Imperial Senate will no longer be of any use to us. I've just learned that the Emperor has dissolved the council permanently. What if in order for him to, because he's consumed by the dark side, he has to spend time in the Bacta tank to keep himself, looking somewhat fresh? I kind of like the idea of bringing in the Emperor into Rogue One to provide a little bit more backstory at a time when we don't see him again until Darth Vader talks to him in The Empire Strikes Back. And so what if we come to find out that when he's not serving on Coruscant in the Imperial Senate, he has to spend time in the Bacta tank to look even somewhat normal because of the fact that the dark side has consumed him? Which would, and again, this is just my total theorization, I just like this idea, which would lend itself to why it is such a big deal in Return of the Jedi when he arrives on the Death Star 2 to see the operations being complete and why he's so decrepit and, looks horrible compared to what we've seen even at the end of Revenge of the Sith. So, be that as it may, throw my theory aside. It's probably completely wrong. Most of my theories actually all of my theories for the most part, apart from a few that I had about the First Order, most of my theories were wrong about The Force Awakens. But I do believe that in that bacta-tank is the Emperor. And I think that the fact that those guards are there is the clue. I think he is going to be in some way, shape, or form a part of Rogue One. Okay, so there's my theory in regards to that. Let's move on to some actual real news as it relates to Rogue One. For those that don't know, Pablo Hidalgo is a member of the Story Group. The Story Group is just what it sounds like. They're a group of Disney, Lucasfilm employees that are tasked with hammering out the canon. They're hammering out the stories for all the different Star Wars entities, the books, video games, comic books, this would be the cartoons, and of course, a part of the movies, kind of a step beneath, the directors and the writers of the films. And Pablo Hidalgo is the main guy. He's the dude. He's on Twitter a lot and answers a lot of questions, gets asked a lot of questions on Twitter. And it's pretty interesting to see his response to things. I would not want his job because there are people that just inundate him with all kinds of... I remember when not like it was a long time ago, but when the Rogue One trailer came out, there were all these people harping on Pablo over the fact that at the end of Revenge of the Sith, you see the framework of the Death Star. And that framework shows a framework of the canon of the Death Star. And then in the Rogue One trailer, you see the cannon being lowered into the Death Star. And they're like, well, how does that make any sense? And Pablo basically talks on Twitter, makes a couple of references to, look, a lot of time goes by between Revenge of the Sith and Rogue One and A New Hope. And that could be a placeholder to keep the framework in place. It could be a socket, in which case, like, you got to screw a light bulb in. And at one point, he actually posted a picture of a socket and said, Episode 3, and then a picture of a bulb in the socket and said Rogue One. It was pretty interesting. But he came out recently because there were a lot of speculation over how perhaps the dude in the bacta-tank that I was talking about in the trailer might be Snoke. And I heard somebody else, and I think it was on the Echo Base podcast, but they had made or it might have been Collider Jedi Council. They made a comment that they felt that Pablo Hidalgo came out because he came out and said that Snoke is not in Rogue One in any way, shape, or form. And somebody had pontificated, if you will, that there are so many fan theories out there, and some of those fan theories are really good. And because we as fans are so hungry to get every single nugget and morsel of Star Wars that we can get, that if a certain fan theory ends up sticking, then when the movie comes out, a big portion of the fan base could end up being disappointed because they grabbed onto a narrative or an idea or a theory that they really wanted to see. And so it sounds like perhaps I liked this idea that, Pablo Hidalgo of the Story Group decided, hey, I'm going to get out ahead of this and let everybody know Snoke ain't in this movie. So don't even go down that road. By the way, for canon, I heard somebody describe it the other day, and I'm probably going to butcher it now, and I think it was actually Pablo on Twitter, had basically said canon simply means that it relates to the movie in some way. That if you have a storyline, it needs to be able to relate to the movie and the movie to it. Does that make sense? And you know what? I did butcher it. They said it in a much better way than I did. So if you don't know what canon is, that's what canon is. It's everything. It has to be able to relate to the movie and not violate what happens in the movie or expand on it too much. But it has to relate exactly to the movie. And Disney, when Disney took over for Lucasfilm, they got rid of, as we've talked about, they got rid of the expanded universe. After the original movies were done, there were books that were written. There was the Heir to the Empire trilogy, and this is where Admiral Thrawn was introduced to him.